Alright, welcome back to the Shaggy Dog Philosophy Podcast. I am the Shaggy Dog Philosopher. You can call me V if you want to call me anything. I have decided today, because I wasn't exactly sure what's on my mind, that I would do some more prepared reading, let's say. I've been talking a lot about the mind-body problem, and about the mind, and about the brain, and about the self. So I did a little bit of research because I wanted to talk. Eventually, I knew I would want to talk about the fact that thoughts about the self are indistinguishable from depression and functional MRI scans. So I did a little bit of research and I found a Nature.com article that I'm going to read today for you, the audience, for your amusement, but I'm also going to spend some time commenting on what it means, what it says. I've done this before. I've done this now in a loosely similar way. This will be the third time. But I have done this very thing where I've read a Nature or an actual psychological journal into the podcast, into this microphone. So I've said repeatedly that if you want to understand the body, the mind-body problem, if you want to understand the self and how the mind works, that you need to listen to me talk. I think that's actually how I ended last episode or the episode before that. Today's background music is a meditation channel that I use when I'm writing, so I will link to that in the description. Thank you to the channel author, creator. What is the name? Here, let me actually find out. Meditation Cloud is the name of the channel, I believe. Alright, so today's article, journal, is titled The Self on Its Axis, A Framework for Understanding Depression. The authors are Christopher G. Davey and Ben J. Harrison. Oh, that's interesting. Anyway, I don't read everything in front of me. I wonder what the Cite This article link does. So anyway, continuing with the abstract. And now we will be quoting pretty heavily and extensively from here. Quote, "The self is experienced differently in depression. It is infused with pervasive low mood and structured by negative self-related thoughts. The concept of the self has been difficult to define, one of the reasons it is now infrequently an object of inquiry for psychiatry, but findings from functional brain imaging and other neuroscience studies have provided new insights." We're going to end quote right there on a period. Yeah, that the concept of the self being difficult to define isn't true, but that insistence that it is difficult to define is in fact why the self isn't studied in science. It's why psychiatry and psychology, clinical and scientific, refuse to study it. They want to say that what the self is difficult to define, or that it's idiosyncratic to every person and therefore impossible to define, but that's just not true. And we'll see if this article, if this journal makes any headway toward having a good definition, and then we'll talk about definitions at the end probably, and we'll definitely be doing it throughout. So continuing in the middle of this paragraph, quote, "They have elucidated how the self is supported by complex hierarchical brain processes. Bodily sensations rise through the spinal cord, brainstem, and subcortical regions through to cortical networks, with the default mode network sitting at the apex, integrating interoceptive signals with information about the extended social environment. End quote. Real quick to discuss what that means. So we're going to read that again. Bodily sensations rise through the spinal cord, brainstem, and subcortical regions through to cortical networks, with the default mode network sitting at the apex, integrating interoceptive signals with information about the extended social environment. Okay, so what that means is what it says, but if you don't know what a cortical network is, that's your brain. Those are different, the cortexes are the different regions of the brain. The default mode network is the structures in the brain that are you. They're your, what I call your habitual state or your habituation. They're what we've discussed in previous episodes are the algorithmic behavior, the algorithmic thinking that you go through. That is your default mode network. Your default mode network is just your default response to your environment. And then, I don't know exactly what an interoceptive signal is. Let's see what that word means. It's an adjective relating to stimuli produced, relating to stimuli produced within an organism, especially in the gut and other internal organs. So your interoreceptive signals would be your gut biome, but also just your body's reaction to things. So like pooping when you're scared. And then the extended social environment is wisdom. What we've been talking about when I talk about wisdom and tradition. Okay, continuing on. Quote, we discuss how this forms a self-axis and demonstrate how this axis is set awry by depression. Our self-axis model of depression establishes a new perspective on the disorder, the depression. It emphasizes the multi-level nature of depression and how impacts made at different explanatory levels influence others along the axis. It suggests that diverse treatments might be effective for depression, from lifestyle interventions to psychotherapies to medications. They target different aspects of the self, but changes at one level of the self-axis can affect others along it. Our framework for depression establishes a central role for the self, which might again become a useful focus of investigation. The self changes in depression. It feels qualitatively different. It is a self that lacks volition, and that is infused with a sense of fatigue and aimlessness. The self is thought about in negative terms. The depressed person ruminates about the self's deficits, feels guilty about past actions, and has a sense of foreboding and hopelessness about their future. When depressed, the way, subquote, we find ourselves in the world, subquote, is not the same, end quote. And now that's got a, what's it called when there's the little number and you're supposed to click that and there's the thing under the page? If you've listened to me read about how idiosyncratic or individually unique thinking leads one to be depressed, you're seeing it brought back here when they say that depression feels different. So the depressed person is an idiosyncratic thinker. We've already described that. We've already discussed that, and here they're discussing it from a different perspective. An idiosyncratic thinker or an already depressed person thinks idiosyncratically or thinks uniquely about their environment and about their experience, whereas people are usually surprised to find out that a person is depressed because no one really thinks your situation is as bad as you do when you're depressed. Just like no one ever really thinks your sports team is as bad as you do. Continuing on, quote, here we explore the idea of the self as experienced differently in depression. We review concepts of the self and how findings from brain imaging research have brought clarity. This research shows that internal models of the self map to brain networks that coordinate and integrate its diverse features, supporting the experience of a unified singular self. That's also got what it's called when you have the number and you're supposed to do the thing. These processes are affected by depression, and we argue that viewing depression via a neuroscientifically informed understanding of the self provides a useful framework for understanding its symptomatic manifestations. It is a perspective that emphasizes depression's multifaceted nature and the multiplicity of approaches that might be effective in treating it. The self-defined. The self has fallen out of focus as an object of investigation in psychiatry. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, disintegration of the self was thought to be inherent in the development of psychotic disorders, and from the early to mid-20th century, psychodynamic theorists believed that disturbances of the ego, a concept not identical with the self but close to it, explained depression. End quote. I'm going to read that again, because I've been writing and talking a lot about the 19th and 20th centuries, so we're going to read that again. During the 19th and 20th centuries, disintegration of the self was thought to be inherent in the development of psychotic disorders. End quote. So disintegration of the self. Integration of the self is mystical woo-woo language if you listen to the people who refuse to study the self. Integration of the self is difficult to talk about and it's difficult to conceptualize, but it's where the self fully integrates as and with the pilot of the body. All right. So we'll get into it and we'll see if they explain what integration of the self as we move forward. But people like Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud are whom they're referring to when they say that during the 19th and 20th centuries, disintegration of the self was thought to be inherent in the development of psychotic disorders. They're referring specifically to Jung and Freud, who believed in a much more spiritual approach to the mind, that you needed, as a person, you needed to fully integrate yourself with the different aspects of yourself, and that you needed... It's interesting what the word integrate even means, because to be integral means to be like core and foundational, right? But the idea was to align yourself within your different selves and to be aware of yourself and your different selves. And like I've said, it's to build up your personal campfire, in the metaphor from my first episode. It's to build up your personal campfire to encompass at least all of your internal surroundings, so that you're perfectly aware of yourself, as a being. That's what, but we've already talked about how psychology wanted to, those psychologists wanted to unify Aristotle's metaphysics with science, that they wanted to be the doctors and the healers and the physicians of they want to be metaphysicians, right? So doctors take Aristotle and they apply the categories to the body, so that we can understand the body well enough to attempt to heal it of any malady, or at least to overcome any evil or any malady of the body, any disorder of the body. The idea of medicine is to be able to do that. And so the idea of psychology or psychiatry. Sorry, I'm looking for a hair tie, and my hair ties seem to have disappeared because my cats can't not climb around on my stuff. Actually, where the heck have they gone? Well, that makes for good radio, doesn't it? Anyway, psychology and psychiatry want to be the practical application of Aristotle's metaphysics. And metaphysics are what we think of today as religion. And so, again, when I say that you can't be a Christian, you can't be a religious person who is a part of a religious organization, and seeing a therapist, I insist that it's because your therapist is religious. Your therapist, you can't be a religious person who's bound to the duty and the responsibility of a religion and go seek healing and therapy from someone outside your religion. It doesn't make sense. Like, a shaman can't heal themselves. They have to go see another shaman, but they can't see a shaman from outside their tradition. The gods conflict. So if you're a Christian and you go and you see a psychotherapist to heal you of the injuries of Christianity, you're putting another god before the God of Christianity. And then if you return to your church, you're betraying the cult of therapy. So you can't do both. You can't do both. And I've lost my own thread because I'm allergic to my own hair, and I really wanted to pull it back into a hair tie, and I can't find one. And all of my... What the hell? That's really weird. There they are. That old... Was it Jeff Foxworthy that had the bit that you found it in the last place you looked? No, it had to have been Bill Engvall. I found it in the last place I looked. Well, yeah. Could you imagine if you'd continued looking for it? I found it in the third place I looked, but I continued looking. It wasn't in any of the other places I looked for it. All right. Here it goes. I'm all anxious, and so being anxious like this just makes me itchy, and it makes it difficult for me to get comfortable. So I'm gonna be bouncing around. I don't know why I'm so anxious today, but this one makes me anxious. I guess because talking about depression has in the past been a trigger point, not for me, but for the people around me. People don't like to talk about what depression is, because people who have chronic depression or people who want to seek treatment for depression don't have depression. What they have is a lack of attention. And so they get depressed, or they manifest long-term sadness because they want other people to manifest happiness in them. But that's not depression. That's just a psychotic disorder. But that's exactly what Jung and Freud were talking about when they said not being integrated in the self. Being integrated in the self is what dog trainers talk about when they talk about a puppy or a dog in general being able to entertain themselves without your attention. Like, chronic depression, or at least people who manifest chronic depression for attention, that's just bad training. And integration, self-integration is being trained to be a person. And that's why I talk about wisdom and tradition being so important, because wisdom and tradition is the very specific training, and wisdom is the opinions. And so in the context of never quite getting where I want to get, and always knowing what I want to say several days after I've hit record, or I've turned off my recording, in fact, gateways and gatekeeping, what I was trying to say is that once a road has been traveled down, you try to keep people from going down it, because you're trying to move forward. You're not trying to explore every road to the end. Some roads are just dead ends, right? And when the people who practice the roads aren't pushing them any further, that's when you know that they occupy a dead end. Okay, and so let's move forward in the middle of this paragraph from the middle of this sentence. Quote, from the early to mid-20th century, psychodynamic theorists believed that disturbances of the ego, a concept not identical with the self but close to it, explained depression, end quote. So the ego and the self, right? So when I talk about the self and I talk about the self being different from the pilot, the ego is kind of like the pilot, right? It's not entirely right, because Freud's theory of the id, the ego, and the superego was incomplete. It was close because it was three, it was triune, but it was incomplete. And we've talked about that before too, so I don't need to talk about all of that. You need to go back and read or listen to my old episodes. Moving forward. Quote, in recent decades, however, conceptualizations of depression have been dominated by focuses on the role of neurotransmitter systems on the one hand and irrational patterns of thought on the other, end quote. So again, we're going to go back and we're going to this is what I'm pushing back on, is that, quote, conceptualizations of depression have been dominated by focuses on the role of neurotransmitter systems and irrational patterns of thought. Okay, so what that means is I get into people a lot when I say that depression is a trigger point conversation for me. It really is, because if anybody should have chronic depression that doesn't allow him to do anything, that leaves him crippled, unable to wake up on time to get to work, unable to get dressed, unable to wash his hair, and unable to do any amount of self-care, it should be me, okay? And so people get really upset when they're like, well, comparatively, no, my parents didn't used to beat the hell out of me and tell me that they wish that I had never been born and that I ruined their lives. So yeah, it should be easy for me, but it's not. And so that's why psychotherapists, that's why they latched onto the idea of the role, that the domination of the role of neurotransmitter systems and irrational thoughts, that they would have looked at the people who were saying, well, I'm chronically depressed because my life is unwinnable, in comparison with a person like me, and even to a person like me, as being irrational. There's no rational way to support being chronically depressed. For I would say, I've never met a person who is chronically depressed who has a rational support for why they're chronically depressed, other than narcissism. Or they insist that what they have is a chemical imbalance, and that's what they mean when they say it's dominated by neurotransmitter systems. They insist on this chemical imbalance that they can't describe. They don't know what the chemicals are. They just know that there's some kind of imbalance, and that these pills that make them prone to suicide and that paralyze them and leave them unable to sleep, fuck, or eat, that those are fixing the imbalance, when, you know, an undepressed person who's not got neurotransmitter system dominated problems is perfectly able to eat, sleep, fuck, and also not have suicidal ideation control their thought systems, their thought patterns. So anyway, don't believe that antidepressants are making you better. Antidepressants are just making you a different kind of zombie. Moving forward, quote, while the latter, that is, irrational patterns of thought, includes distorted thoughts about the self, it is the negative character of the thoughts that have been the focus of attention. These theories of depression have tended to focus on only single explanatory levels, but, as Kindler has argued, the complex nature of mental illnesses suggests they are much better understood as arising from the interaction of multiple levels. End quote. So what this journal is trying to do is by creating this self-axis, it's trying to create an abstract multi-dimensional model of the self. In much the same way that I keep explaining to you that there's an up and there's a down, there's an above and there's a below. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to integrate the mysticism and the esotericism of Carl Jung back into scientific, skeptical psychology. And because the esoteric language already has code words and already has words that have intentionally misunderstood meanings, that is, intentionally what they would have called in the medieval world and what they would have called in the pre-modern world occulted meaning. And now the esotericists don't want to occult the meaning of the words. It's the people like the scientific skeptics, the Christians, etc., the people that don't want Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud and their ilk, the psychoanalysts, the mystical esoteric psychoanalysts that don't want them in the scientific community. The very people that made it so that we couldn't test the mind-body problem in big schools like Stanford, which were in fact invented. Their psychology programs were in fact, I'm learning, invented to study the mind-body problem, and specifically to study parapsychology. But you're not even allowed to say the word parapsychology out loud without being laughed out of the conversation. So anyway, what this article is trying to do is it's trying to map out a multi-dimensional, they call it an axis, but they're trying to map out a multi-dimensional Cartesian environment of the internal self. So what they're trying to actually map out the id, the ego, the superego, the self, and the various selves, in the same way that I've drawn it out for you previously. So we'll see how they compare and where I disagree is what I'm doing. Moving forward. Quote, "The self has faded as a focus of study, in part because it is not clear what constitutes the object of investigation. What is the self? We have an intuitive grasp of what is meant by it, although it escapes easy definition. There is, however, reasonably broad agreement as to its essential features, enough agreement to allow a sketch of the self that can be linked to underlying brain processes. The experiential and narrative selves. There are two basic aspects of the self. The first is the self that we experience in the present moment. It forms our subjective sense of being, and we apprehend its presence without need of focusing our attention on it. It has been described variously as the core self, the basic self, the minimal self, and the pre-reflective self. We use the term experiential self, as suggested by Epstein and Zahavi, to highlight that this aspect of the self is known by direct experience without need for cognitive elaboration. The experiential self is somatically embedded, influenced by the homeostatic state of the body, and experienced in subjective qualitative terms, in particular, as a self with an affective tone. It is this aspect of the experiential self that we argue is most pertinent to understanding depression," end quote, in the middle of a paragraph, because I want to know what they are trying to say there, because reading it didn't mean anything to me. Reading it again. The experiential self is somatically embedded, that is, influenced by the did they spell that wrong? Homeostatic. They did not, in fact, spell that word correctly in this article. They spelled it homoeo, and it is in fact not spelled that way. Oh, in Britain it is spelled that way. The state of steady internal physical, chemical, and social conditions maintained by living systems. Homeostatic is that. The experiential self is somatically embedded and experienced in subjective, qualitative terms, in particular as a self with an affective tone. That doesn't mean anything. It is this that doesn't mean anything. What does somatically mean if I don't know? Affecting or characteristic of the body as opposed to the mind or spirit. Okay, so what they're trying to say is the experiential self is a function of the body. It's a function of the brain, and how well the experiential self actually experiences itself is influenced primarily by the chemical and neural functioning of the brain and the gut biome. Moving forward. Quote, "It is this aspect of the experiential self that we argue is most pertinent to understanding depression. Damasio refers to the affective component of the experiential self as being composed of, quote, or subquote, background emotions, subquote, that he says provide, subquote, the feeling of life itself, the sense of being, subquote. These affective states, or moods, reflect the state of the body, influenced by processes such as states of wakefulness and satiety, or the lack of them, by illnesses and their accompanying inflammatory processes, and by discrete emotional experiences. They index the current state of the body as it finds itself in the world. Moods are internal, subjective experiences that cannot be reduced to more fundamental experiences. They might have external manifestations, but the mood state itself is private." End quote. So, in the context of depression, what we're talking about is idiosyncratic thinking again. That the mood state is the pre-verbal or subconscious thought, reaction. And so, the mood state is, I mean, everybody knows what their mood is. Everybody knows their state of mind. Like when you're just in a bad mood, you're going to interpret everything as negative in some way. And so what they're saying is that depression is a mood state. Depression is it's a pre-verbal, and sometimes not even pre-verbal. I mean, I have in my own mind made the decision to be in a shit mood today and just manifest my being depressed. And depressed is just, it's being in a negatively framed mood state for a long period of time is what they're about to tell us. Okay, moving forward. Quote, "The second aspect of the self is that which becomes the object of our attention in this article. This aspect of the self is composed of self and self-other, i.e. social, representations. It has been referred to as the empirical self, the autobiographical self, and the cognitive self. We use the term narrative self, as suggested by Dennett and favored by Gallagher, to highlight that this is an aspect of the self that is perceived as having continuity over time and that exists in a matrix of associations derived from experience," end quote, in the middle of a paragraph. That narrative self is the self that they talk about in, let's say, spiritual but not religious or psychedelic literature or conversations, and those communities when they talk about the death of the ego. When they talk about ego death, they're talking about death of the narrative self. They're talking when the esoteric community, when I talk about the death and rebirth in these various spiritual traditions or religious traditions, these different wisdom traditions, right? The death and rebirth is the death and the rebirth of the narrative self. It's the ending of a habituation of thought and a beginning of a new habituation of thought. Or it's a death of an understanding of who you are and what you are, and then it's a new beginning in the narrative, so to speak. And the narrative self, as they're using it, is an intentional, maybe intentional, but it is a direct apprehension, a direct misunderstanding of who is in fact the author of your life. The narrative self believes that it is the author, and the author is a confusion or it's a miscategorization of God. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to say that the thinker is God, proved by the act of thought itself. continuing on from the middle of the paragraph, quote, "The narrative self builds on and extends the experiential self. We have a sense of the self as having existed in the past, and we can envision its presence in the future. This is a sense of self that incorporates Cooley's, subquote, looking glass self, subquote, a, subquote, looking glass, subquote, being an archaic term for a mirror. We think about how we appear to others and about how we are assessed by them. We assume that others think about us in the same way we think about them, and have an internal representation of the shape such thoughts take. The narrative self is psychological content that is influenced by sociocultural factors, by the nature of the community in which we reside, both in the context of family and friendships and in the context of broader societal influences," end quote. I'm going to move back up because there was a lot in that. What they were saying earlier is the narrative self builds on and extends the experiential self. So the narrative self sees the self over time, and the experiential self sees itself in time. So when you look back on yourself, what they're saying is the narrative self is in a lot of ways the part of you that is able to be self-critical. So it's in a lot of ways it's the narrative self, as they're using the term, is an over mind. It's an over self that exists within the experiential self, because the experiential self is all of your environmental sense data. Okay, and so what they're saying when they say the looking glass self, a looking glass is an archaic term for a mirror, what they're saying is that the narrative self is able to look at the experiential self and see the narrative self in all of the noise. Okay? It's able to identify itself, and it's able to identify the behavior and the sense information coming into the experiential self that is other. What the narrative self is responsible for doing is identifying self from other, because as I've told you, there's a lot of information that is coming into the brain, and the brain system is not responsible for sorting any of it. It's responsible for bringing it in and reacting appropriately to it. And then there's a system within the brain whose job it is to categorize it all, sort it and categorize it all, and find meaning in it. And then there's a function within that function of the brain that is supposed to identify that all it's doing is that me or is that other? Is it me or is it other? And it's sorting through the good and the bad of what's me and what's other. And what happens when you have a non-integrated self is where you misidentify me and other, where you start to identify me in things that are other and harmful or poisonous or evil to you, and you start to identify other within you and identify that as poisonous or harmful. It's sort of like being allergic to your own hair. It's your body not being able, or it's literally your body. It's literally a function of your brain being not able to identify what thoughts and feelings you have that are yours, and then attacking them and breaking them down. And I could very much be looking at this through a complex post-traumatic stress disorder lens, because I don't have a lot of these systems. I don't have a lot of these systems built in. A lot of mine were broken and removed from me so that I had to cobble them together. So a lot of my own brain systems are very much jury-rigged from scrap parts. So I could be talking about myself through this, but I very much want you, my potential audience, thinking about yourselves, not so much me and who I am, because me and who I am is only instructive to you if you also have CPTSD that leaves you without a personality. So let's move forward in recapping what we were talking about. So when the article says, or the journal says, quote, "We assume that others think about us in the same way we think about them," That's a comma, and I'm going to end quote there. When I recently had an experience where I was trying to explain this to someone, that there are more than two ways to view the world, but there are two ways in which the world is viewed. And you can assume without much experience or without much interaction with a person, if you understand what to look for, which of the two ways this person habitually views the world. Okay, so the way that women used to view the world, the way that it used to be, is that women viewed the world in one way and men viewed the world in another way, in the ancient world. And the way that women viewed the world, the way that women's religion taught women, and women were supposed to teach their husbands and their children to view the world, is that I am you, and you are me, and what is good for you is also good for me. Because what is good for me is also good for you. And we're going to make our decisions based on that thinking. Men habitually thought, and now most of the world habitually thinks, that I am me, you are not me, what is good for me is evil for you, and what is good for you is evil for me. Now, those are not the only two ways to think about the world. Because if you find yourself in a situation, especially when you're dealing with someone in the opposite, and you realize that what's good for them is good for them, but it might be bad for you, but what's good for you might be bad for them, but it's good for you both to pursue your own goods, even though you want to be pursuing a common good. The common good in that could be seeking good separately. Like that makes a marriage seem like, well, we should never have been married, right? But if the marriage, but that's irrelevant, because I don't want to talk about breakups in this, just because breakups are recently on my mind. You run into cognitive dissonance when you view the world from one algorithmic way of thinking, and you don't have a way of appreciating exception, and you don't have a way of incorporating new data. Okay? And so people don't think about us in the same way we think about them. And depression, idiosyncratic thinking, has shown that depression is when you think that people think negatively about you. I've talked about how guilt isn't your emotion. You don't feel guilty. You feel like you should feel guilty, and guilt is the feeling that other people are going to disapprove of your choices, right? Guilt and regret are different things. If you feel bad about a choice you made, you don't feel guilty for having made the choice. You feel regretful for having made the choice. But if what you feel, if the emotion that you respond with is guilt, that means that you know that other people are going to think that what you've done is bad, not that you think that what you've done is bad. So moving on, and repeating this paragraph, the narrative self has psychological content that is influenced by socio-cultural factors, by the nature of the community in which we reside, both in the context of family and friendships, and in the context of broader societal influences. And that's what I'm talking about. That's an end quote, by the way. That's what I'm talking about when I say that your ethnicity matters. Your ethnicity and your race, they both matter to who you are, and acting like they don't matter to who you are is why people are depressed and why people feel like they're at a dead end, is because they've abandoned their ethnicity and your race, and your power, your social network come from your ethnicity and your race. They come from your immediate community that you were raised in, and they come from the immediate people from which you sprung forth. Moving on now with a new paragraph. Quote, "The changing but singular self. Our sense of ourselves is dynamic, varying with the nature of the representations presented to conscious awareness. It not only varies in content, but also to the extent that the self is represented. When we are focused on tasks, on events in the external world, we can sometimes have no awareness of the self at all. We lose ourselves in our work. Similar experiences are reported by people who engage in deep meditation or in psychedelic drug experiences. In depression, the converse is often true. The depressed person can become so absorbed with internal processes that they find it difficult to focus on events outside of themselves. An important feature of the self is that it is perceived as a unitary phenomenon. While we emphasize two aspects of the self, experiential and narrative, they are not experienced as one and are in fact not cleanly delineated, but exist at either end of a continuum. The sense of self can vary in different contexts and during different periods of life, including during depression, and can sometimes feel more fragmented and at others more cohesive, which might suggest we contain multiple and divided selves. The self, as we have defined it, however, while complex and changeable, is experienced as singular, in part because the self is intimately related to a single body. It has a unitary character that we experienced as being at some point central part of our conscious awareness, as captured by Strawson's description of the self as an internal mental presence, and Dennett's as the center of narrative gravity. In summary, the essential characteristics of the self as we have defined it, are 1. The self is apprehended as a unitary phenomenon, although it consists of different aspects. 2. One aspect, the experiential self, forms our fundamental sense of being. It is embedded in our body and is imbued by the mood states that arise from somatic processes. 3. The other aspect, the narrative self, is the self that we can think about and that we have reason to believe other people think about in the same way that we think about them. 4. These aspects exist at either ends of a continuum and coexist at any particular time to a greater or lesser extent. 5. The self varies in its presentation, with different aspects present in different contexts, which might suggest that it doesn't really exist at all, but to most of us the self exists as a matter of everyday experience. I'm going to end quote there, because all of that was wrong. All of that's wrong. It's very interesting. They want to talk about an axis, but they're not creating a multi-dimensional Cartesian plane on which to work. They're creating a linear spectrum. They've taken a line segment and they've blocked it off, and they've said on the left end of this is the experiential self and on the right end is the narrative self, and they're just dead ass wrong. I've already shown that it's more like the brain itself. So the brain itself is the stem, and the stem comes up from the neck, and the neck is connected to the spine, and the spine is where all of the nerves that go throughout all of your body are. So all of the nerves in all of your body go into the brainstem, and the brainstem is where all of that information is flooded. All of that information goes there, and then from there it's sent to different areas of the brain, which is exactly what I said. If there is an experiential self, it resides in the brainstem, and it's that part of you, it's the gatekeeper, right? It's that gatekeeper of all that information that's saying, okay, which of this body stimulation do I need to think about? Which of this body stimulation do I need to pay attention to? Which of the environmental stimulations do I need to pay attention to? Do I need to pay attention to any of them? Like it says, when you get your hands, like I've been demonstrating with the podcast, when you get your hands and your eyes going, you can forget about the self entirely. That's why people who spend all of their time engaging with narrative storytelling confuse themselves with the fictional characters that they're engaged with. That's why people will cosplay and prefer the personality of the cosplay rather than their own. That's how, I described how even my own experience as an actor, I got confused within myself with the actor, with the part that I was acting. But But saying that it's a left right, that it's only a binary and it's only linear is wrong. It's at least 3-dimensional, but it's definitely 4 to 7 dimensions. It's so many more than just 1-dimensional. It's not 1-dimensional, it's not binary. They're just wrong about that. I mean, I already described that if they're right in their terminology, and I don't know that they're right in their terminology, but the experiential self is a bowl. It's a mushroom. It's a stem that goes up into a cap, into a bowl that collects all the information, and everything that goes past it goes exactly like how it looks in the brain. There's a round, clustered, almost brain-shaped spot in the very center of the brain that connects directly to the brainstem, and that is where the first higher level reactions to the environment happen. That's where your motor function happens, but that's where you're able to stop and begin. That's where the brain begins its self-analytical process. But there is another brain structure outside that. There's a third brain structure outside that further analyzes and sorts that information before that information even makes it into the back of the brain, which is the further younger but still older structure than the front of the brain. It gets to the back of it goes into the brainstem, and then it goes into these two structures in the center of the brain. Then the information bounces to the back of the brain. Then the information bounces from the back of the brain to the hemispheres, the left and right hemispheres of the brain, which then send the signals across the corpus callosum and then back across the corpus callosum. And then that information goes into the frontal lobe where your high level thinking is. So there are at least 5 different selves within the structures of the brain that are all not competing for time or energy, but that are all working together in concert. And so integration is where information passes from the experience of the senses into the brainstem, and all of the emotional and cognitive responses are in line with one another. That thoughts and feelings aren't pinballing wildly around inside your brain in a way that you have no ability to control them. Depression and anxiety, chronic depression and chronic anxiety, is the feeling that you're too stupid to control your own thoughts. And if you can't control your own thoughts, you can't master your environment. And if you can't master your environment, you can't do the basic human task of putting a name to everything and walls around everything that you can control. That's the basic. It doesn't even need to be biblical, because the Genesis writers stole the commandment to Adam to name and tame the world. Like, they stole that. They didn't come up with that originally. But that is what you want to do. That's what your brain wants to do, is name and tame everything. You, if you're a woman, you want to name and tame a man so that you can name and raise tame children. If you're a man, you want to name and tame a woman so that she will raise and tame your tame children. Like, that's what civilization is. That's what we agreed civilization was 20 or 50,000 or 100,000 years ago. Okay, so the self in depression. Moving forward, quote, "Depression has a profound effect on a person's subjective sense of being in the world. It is not simply the same self as it was before, but with symptoms of depression superimposed on it. It is now a different self, inhabiting a world that is perceived in a different way. It is a self that is instilled with a pervasive low mood, inhabiting a world that lacks possibility for positive experiences, and in which there is, in any case, no energy or motivation to pursue positive experiences." End quote. That's true enough. The self isn't different. In fact, the chronically depressed person identifies that the depression, the lack of positive motivation, or the lack of energy or motivation to pursue positive experiences, they think that is the default mode state. So they're more comfortable in that state, because that state the lacking energy or motivation to pursue positive experiences, the reason psychology used to identify mania and depression as opposites, and the reason they call bipolar, so the reason they're so freaked out by what they now call bipolar and what they used to call manic depression, is because there are people that will bounce out of their depression and actually believe all of the patronizing pseudo-psychological babble about grabbing the horse by the reins and all these things, right? And so they'll use their depressive state to gather up their energy, and then they'll enter what psychologists refer to as a manic state, where they have too much energy. And what happens for the bipolar person frequently is that because they don't have anyone, I'm like this, the manic depressive person, and I am very much like this, because they don't have anyone else pumping their billows for them. Once the manic state, once they get tired, they have to go into the depressive state in order to conserve what energy they have remaining in order to go back to their own personal bellows. So moving on, quote, "The symptoms that comprise the diagnosis of major depressive disorder can be usefully categorized into symptoms that reflect affect and drive, depressed mood, anhedonia, and reduced motivation, that have cognitive manifestations, self-criticism, concentration difficulties, and suicidal thoughts, and that reflect basic life processes, changes in sleep, appetite, and psychomotor activity. These symptoms can be present in many combinations, and in the case of somatic processes can be of opposite polarities, such that these are argued to be multiple types of depression. Efforts to categorize depression over the past century, melancholic versus non-melancholic, typical versus atypical, have not proven to be clinically useful." End quote on a semicolon. That's what I'm telling you, is that the discussion around depression is completely fucking useless. It was more useful in the Victorian era to talk about melancholy than it is depression. Because like a kidnapping or like an abduction or like a missing person, depression isn't depression until it becomes a default state of being, until it's over time. That's why when you are depressed and you come to work and you're like, "Hey, I'm depressed. I've not been feeling great for a while. I'm depressed." They're like, "Well, you didn't seem unhappy, so just be happy." And it's like, sure, I made myself smile when I didn't want to, and now even that isn't working anymore. I need help, is what I'm saying. When people tell you they're depressed, they're telling you it's not working anymore. The ways that they know to fight it themselves aren't working anymore. You need to give them a hand job. That's the only thing that'll help. They figured that out. The Victorians at least figured that out. All right, moving on. Quote, "In part," that is, efforts to categorize depression over the past century have not proven to be clinically useful, in part because the symptoms do not segregate in consistent ways. Because, end quote, again, depression is idiosyncratic thinking. So when a therapist asks you, "Why are you depressed?" and you're like, "Well, I'm depressed for my reasons," and the therapist goes, "But those are bad reasons. Just don't think like that." And you're like, "Well, I'm intelligent and I'm an idiosyncratic thinker, and you're unintelligent because you're a therapist. Therefore, you're a would it be a non-idiosyncratic thinker? You're a syncratic thinker. So you can't think in the way that I do. You can't. Your therapist literally can't understand the way you think. All they can do is compare the way you think with the way they've been told that other people think, if they're new at it, or to the various other people that they've, in air quotes, helped through their depression. They don't actually have any experience of being an idiosyncratic thinker. Your therapist can't help you. They just can't help you. In the same way that we gave up on religion because it actually can't help. All it can do is tell you the ways that have worked in the past to defeat the suffering. You can't actually defeat the suffering, and that's what depression is. Moving on, quote, "More recent approaches have examined the symptoms of depression using network analyses, demonstrating how the presence of particular symptoms seems to drive the development of others. which in combination with other symptoms influence yet others in patterns that are complex and variable. While these analyses confirm that symptomatic patterns do not form readily identifiable subtypes, they show that some symptoms are more fundamental than others, and central to depression is a depressed mood. Depressed mood, disruptive somatic functions, and the self. The self in depression is imbued by depressed mood, which colors all aspects of a person's experience of themselves. Depressed mood is, like the self, difficult to define, with one of its very characteristics its seeming ineffability. End quote. That's just nonsense. Moving on. Quote, as the writer William Styron describes it, subquote, depression is a disorder of mood, so mysteriously painful and elusive in the way it becomes known to the self, to the mediating intellect, as to verge close to being beyond description, end subquote, and end quote on a period. That's just wrong. This is what I'm telling you. Therapist, your psychologist can't understand you. They literally find you mystifying. They find you and your thoughts and your description of your environment ineffable. They think you're describing God. These people are completely unqualified to be doing this, even to be writing what they're writing. I mean, listen to this language. Depression is a disorder of mood, so mysteriously painful and elusive in the way it becomes known to the self, to the mediating intellect, as to verge close to being beyond description. End quote. These people think they're philosophers. This person, William Styron, he thinks he's Nietzsche. I find it offensive. Moving on. Quote, it is often described in analogical and metaphorical terms. For example, as like inhabiting a bleak shadowland, or a darkness closing in, or some kind of hell containing nothing from which one could obtain relief or comfort. End quote. All of those were subquotes. Yeah, it's just suffering. It's just suffering. It's just the terror of history. Moving on. Quote, depressed mood is an emergent property of processes related to the somatic state. It is a concomitant of the alterations in sleep, appetite, psychomotor activity, energy levels, sex drive, gastrointestinal function, and pain sensitivity that are characteristic of depression. It can arise as a result of physical illness. The low mood that often accompanies a short-lived viral infection is familiar to most of us. Depressed mood shapes the experiential self to give it its qualitative attributes, and by doing so influences cognitive representations of the self. End quote. I'm going to have to back up because I stopped paying attention when they likened it to the short-lived the low mood that accompanies a short-lived viral infection. It's what I've been talking about throughout these podcasts. Intellectual contagion. Your thoughts are to your brain like the bodies in your blood. And you have structures in your brain just like you have white blood cells in your blood vessels, your veins, to attack and destroy thoughts that you identify as other than yourself. And depression is where you identify all of your thoughts as other than yourself. This is why people with chronic depression and anxiety identify the depression and the anxiety. And again, anxiety is the realization that you're too stupid to have made it as long as you are, and the thought or the belief that you're too stupid and to get smarter enough to continue living into the future. And that is examining yourself over time poorly. That's not actually having critical thinking skills, the critical thinking skills necessary to critically self-analyze well. But this isn't confusing, and this isn't mysterious. This is all very easy and very obvious. Moving forward. No, not moving forward yet, because I want to say it again. Your brain, whether you are or not, there are structures within your brain that are monitoring your pre-verbal thoughts. They're monitoring your mood. And so when you're in a bad mood and I were to ask you, hey, why are you in a bad mood today? And you don't have an answer other than coming up with a bunch of reasons to be angry or in a bad mood, it's because your mood is pre-verbal. You have pre-verbally made the decision to interpret everything that happens in your environment as being in some way hateful to you. Your state of mind is your choice, whether it's pre-verbal or not. You do make the choice, and it is negative thoughts inhabiting a default mode set where your thoughts are negative and you attack all incoming emotions and all incoming thoughts is exactly like being allergic to your own hair. It's exactly the same as being allergic to yourself. You set up a white blood cell defense network against everything so you can be at war with everything, because sometimes being at war with everything, always being in fight, not flight, not fawn, not, what was the other one? Fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. Not freezing, not fawning, not being willing to retreat. Sometimes fighting, manifesting anger against everything is the last resort and the only thing that makes the depression and the suffering of life livable, is actively combating it by misidentifying everything as the suffering. And this is what they're saying in the next sentence. So moving on with a quote, by quoting, "Depressed mood shapes the experiential self to give it its qualitative attributes, and by doing so influences cognitive representations of the self. As we will discuss, the brain regions that instantiate the core aspects of the self send descending projections to the hypothalamus and brainstem regions that regulate sleep, appetite, and other drives. These basic life functions therefore not only shape the experiential self, but are influenced by the very brain processes that give rise to it. The recursive relationship between these basic drives and the self is indicative of the deeper homeostatic functions the drives subserve, and highlights how the enduring function of the self is to promote the maintenance of homeostatic processes in the face of environmental demands, i.e. allostasis. Understanding depression as a response to allostatic load, manifested by disturbance in basic life functions, inherently involves a change in the way the self is experienced." Okay, so I can end quote there and say that I have said all of that much more clearly than they did. None of that was clear to me, but I know I've said all of that basically. So we're just going to continue moving on. This is a much longer journal than the last one I read, so I'm probably not going to read all of it. Quote, "Negative views of the self in depression. Depression affects the way people think about themselves, with the self characteristically seen in a negative light, in the present and across time. The depressed person sees themselves, says Beck, as, subquote, defective, inadequate, diseased, or deprived, end quote, and, subquote, tends to attribute his or her unpleasant experiences to a psychological, moral, or physical defect, end subquote, end quote, entirely." I want to talk about that. The psychological community have a lot to do with that. So the religious community have a lot to do with why people were obsessed with sin and obsessed with their own fault. But hear this: defective, inadequate, diseased, deprived. That these are the same words that Protestants and Catholics both use to describe themselves, not just their societies, but themselves. Diseased. But look at this: defective, diseased. What do you think is happening when you tell someone that you have a disorder, that you have a diagnosis for what they're doing, and it ends in disorder? Psychology is doing the problem. Psychology is the reason that people see themselves as diseased or deprived or inadequate, right? terming what's going on with you a disorder or a disease. They say mental disease. You have mental illness. They don't say, oh, well, you just have self-harmful patterns of thought, which is the case. No, they say illness. They say disease. They have to use that language because they're competing with the medical community. We've already talked about this, and I talked about it badly. But they're trying to compete with the medical community, because when you have a disease, when you have liver disease, you have liver disease, right? Your liver is diseased. When you have heart disease, you have heart disease. And there are underlying conditions. There's an underlying environmental factors for why you have these diseases, right? If you drink too much alcohol, your body's fucking going to die from drinking too much alcohol. If you smoke cigarettes, yeah, you're going to get heart disease. If you have gingivitis because you don't take care of your teeth well enough, Vincent, me, yeah, you're going to get heart disease. Your teeth are going to rot. They're going to fall out. But mental health is not analogous. It's not the same. When I say, well, the reason that you're depressed is because of a pattern and a series of it's because of the habituation of your thoughts isn't true. Sometimes you do suffer. We all suffer, right? And if you don't know how to alleviate the suffering in a healthy way that will prevent you from suffering again, yeah, that's depression. Depression is when you go, I don't know how to fix my problems over the aggregate, and seeing myself not knowing how to fix my problems and hurting myself and others causes me to hate myself. And that self-hatred manifests as chronic depression. Moving on, quote, depression affects the way people think about themselves, with the self characteristically seen in a negative light, in the present and across time. Wait a minute, I already said that part. Not only does the depressed person think about themselves in more negative terms, but they are also more sensitive to indicators that support their views. For example, by selectively focusing on negative feedback, and by recalling more negative self-descriptors. End quote. Or like what I do when I write a piece and I send it out to get like an alpha reader commentary on it, and really what I want to hear is, that was good, I would like more of this, but I really want more of that. And then I want to hear, hey, have you done more of that within a few days, because I've gotten myself depressed that it wasn't exactly perfect, and I can't just be done with it forever, which is what I want. And anyway, that's that. Moving forward. Quote, the way the self is understood in the context of relationships also changes with depression. The depressed person believes that they place a burden on people within their social networks, no longer feels the same sense of belonging to them, and finds social events different to enjoy. They respond by withdrawing from social interactions, and their isolation reinforces their negative beliefs about themselves. End quote. And see, this is where the lie of intro and extroversion comes in. The introvert is not an introvert. The introvert is depressed. The reason the introvert is depressed is because the introvert has been given language to convince themselves that they're not an extrovert. In fact, the introvert has been given language to convince themselves that they are in some way deficient. Introversion is treated like a disease among the introverted. Like extroversion is a disease, and they're gonna catch it. Like we used to think you were gonna catch gay, or like people say you're gonna, like, stupid is catching, right? But it's true. People with a positive affect are contagious. We say that all the time. His positivity is contagious. He's infectious. We say that all the time. Quote, they respond by withdrawing from social interactions, and their isolation reinforces their negative beliefs about themselves. A commonly observed symptom in depression is an increase in self-focused attention. People with depression spend more time thinking about themselves and can find it difficult to switch their attention to events outside themselves. Once they have switched their attention to external events, they often find it difficult to maintain their concentration. They more readily revert to self-related thoughts, manifesting as distressing rumination. We might understand that the low mood that permeates the self draws attention to internal processes. Such negatively balanced affective processes not only capture attention, but also imbue narrative conceptions of the self with negative content, which further focuses attention on the self. That the self is experienced differently in depression has long been clear, but the brain mechanisms that might help to explain it have been less so." End quote. This is what I'm saying. Depression is a cry for attention. It's not a cry for help. I mean, it is. When you tell another person, "I am depressed," but manifesting depression and not telling someone, "Hey, I'm depressed," is a cry not for help. It's a cry for attention. Because children, especially young girls, tend to get a lot of positive emotional attention heaped on them when they're sad. And so what they do as they move into adulthood is they never learn to move past the being sad part. Like, they never realize that sometimes you do need a reason to be sad and have good things heaped on you. It's like, yeah, your dog died. Okay, here's presents and time and attention, but you work a 9-to-5 job and can't go to France on a whim is not a good reason to be chronically depressed. As an example, I was watching something recently where a character wanted to travel France, and she was depressed about it because she was poor and she would never get to do it. And a boy bought her the ticket, and it bothered me. I don't know why it bothered me, and I don't know why I'm thinking about it now, because I don't remember the exact specifics, but it bothered me because it's like, that's gonna make her happy. No, working for it and getting to earn it because of the thing that made her sad, overcoming the sadness by fighting it and defeating it would make her happy. The memories she's going to make in France now with somebody else's money are just going to be empty because she didn't earn them. But now I'm talking about Sea of Stars again, and how the ending of that game, I didn't earn it. It was too easy, and my characters and I made no choices throughout. And that's what I'm saying. She didn't make a choice. All she did was have a boy who liked her. And that's why feminists don't like men, but that's why third and the coming fourth wave feminism don't make any sense. Because you just want to use us like we're the Federal Reserve. But why shouldn't you? Your leadership, your liberal, progressive, feminist leadership have been using the Federal Reserve like it literally prints free money for the last 2 decades. So why shouldn't you follow the example of your leaders when I've been talking throughout that the people that, whether you elect them or not, and when you elect them, you're allowed to not think about it, the representational aspect of the fact that these are the people that you're emulating on every level of society. So let's just move forward, because I'm not even a fifth of the way through this article. I'm not going to make it to the end. A brain model of the self. Quote, "The self might not exist in the same way that the heart or spleen exists, but it is nonetheless a dynamic entity that is closely tied to underlying brain processes. Mapping the self to such processes has been facilitated by the development of brain imaging techniques, and especially functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. These methodologies have led to the identification of distinct brain activity signatures that support the generation of internal mental experiences, arguably one of the most original and significant achievements of human neuroimaging research. The default mode network and the self. The brain regions that have come to be most identified with the self comprise the default mode network, which incorporates midline medial prefrontal cortex, that is, DMN is default mode network, and midline medial prefrontal cortex, MPFC, and posterior cingulate cortex, PCC, and well as the anterior Damn, these words are not easy to say, and they fucked up their syntax here. That should be as well as the inferior parietal lobes, and other regions. The DMN default mode network was first described in early nuclear imaging studies when these regions were found to display a unique pattern of activity that was more pronounced during passive mental states, such as wakeful rest, than during goal-directed cognitive tasks. End quote. This is what I'm telling you. The default mode network is your pre-verbal, pre-cognitive thinking. It's your default state. It's your habituation. It's how you have learned to automatically respond to what's going on in your environment. Moving on. Quote, the concept of a default mode conveyed the idea that this was a pattern of brain activity that was consistently suppressed during task performance, when one's attention was externally focused and was defaulted back to in the absence of such task demands. It was hypothesized that DMN regions, especially the medial frontal cortex, supported the introspective, self-oriented mental processes that are characteristic of resting state conditions. The link between DMN function and resting mental activity has since been extensively characterized. End quote. This is what I'm talking about. When you're sitting around and you're not doing anything, and you're feeling emotions but you don't know what they are, and you're thinking thoughts but you don't know what they are, and then someone says something and you say a non sequitur and they're like, why did you say that? And you're like, I don't know. The answer is what Freud said. It's because you're thinking about it in a pre-verbal way. It's your default mode network is working at whatever this thing that you have decided is a contagion or is an allergen or is an invasive thought. You're just at it, and that it's the Gordian knot part of your brain. Moving on. Quote, the idea that DMN activity underpins self-related processes has been supported by task-based fMRI studies. The tasks have directly addressed self-referential thought and have also assessed autobiographical memory and future forecasting, moral decision-making, and theory of mind. They have provided some of the clearest evidence of the DMN's involvement in functions related to the self. Importantly, across these different task domains, only a subset of DMN regions are commonly engaged. That is, while DMN activity has been anatomically characterized in each of the aforementioned task domains, there exists a smaller core set of regions that support self-related processes in a more domain-general manner. Although the precise computations supported by these core regions remain to be fully understood, it has been suggested that they might support basic self-oriented evaluations of the significance, value, and meaning of stimuli. As I've said, these are the different, there are multiple stations in the brain that are set up to collect incoming information, so that anything that's in your default mode network, because your hands and your eyes and your mouth and your brain, you're active on something outside yourself, doesn't mean that your internal processes aren't holding thoughts back to work on them for when you're not engaged on something else. That's why people who spend all of their time distracting themselves can't sleep, because as soon as they lie down and they rest at all, the DMN, the default mode network of their brain, and these substations of their brain that have been holding these things that they need to be putting their attention on at some point during the day, all fire at once. That's what anxiety is. It's realizing that you're too stupid to think about the things that you need to be thinking about when you need to be thinking about them. Moving on, quote, in our own work, we emptied a task designed to isolate the activity of core DMN regions during the appraisal of personality traits and use a network modeling approach to determine their dynamic interactions. We found that self-appraisal was primarily coordinated by the PCC, with its activity modulated by regulatory feedback from the MPFC. In functional terms, we suggested that narrative self-representations, such as those engaged during the semantic processing of personality trait adjectives, were dynamically accessed via PCC through its dense connections with posterior and temporal brain systems, and gated into conscious awareness by activity in the MPFC, end quote, in the middle of a paragraph. So just for the record, if you think that I'm unqualified to talk about this stuff, they are now using the language that I have been using to break it down for you. Gateways, gating. Your brain is a city. Moving on in the middle of the paragraph, quote, this hypothesized gateway function of the core MPFC region aligns with its location in frontopolar cortex. The regions appear to coordinate competing internal and external representations, including self-representations, to guide ongoing thought processes and behavior. We argued that it was via these dynamic interactions that a unitary sense of self emerged. This conception of the core DMN as a self-making network is reinforced by findings that these regions are among the brain's most highly integrated. End quote in the middle of a paragraph. I want to say that again. I just want to say that. The DMN is the self-making network of your brain. So the dying and being reborn, that's a function of the DMN. You have to constantly allow your self-conception to die and be remade and die and be remade. And what that means is you have to be willing to start over at the foundation setting phase of you making frequently. And you have to be willing to do it, and when it happens, you have to go about it forthrightly and immediately. Because the longer you allow yourself to either be dead or be unfounded, unintegrated, the longer you do permanent damage to your brain structure. Not just in an abstract way. Living in ego death causes brain damage. I have read articles, and we could switch over to that if I wanted to prove to you that the grief process is a process of ego death, and it does cause brain damage. So when I said that grief is retarded, grief is also retardation. All right, let's move forward. Quote, recent characterizations of the DMN's connectional anatomy have recognized its position at the apex of a deep hierarchy of brain systems, existing at one end of a spectrum, which starts with primary sensory and motor cortices at the other. What? Okay. Intermediate to these are the sensory and motor association areas and other association networks that are involved with conceptual organization of information related to environmental input, such as the central executive and salience interoceptive networks. Being the least tethered of association networks to inputs from the external environment, the DMN appears to act as a master integrator of representational content across other brain systems, providing it with a unique capacity for integrated information processing. End quote. I'm going to read that again. Being the least tethered of association networks to inputs from the external environment, the DMN appears to act as a master integrator of representational content across other brain systems, providing it with a unique capacity for integrated information processing. What that means is that your default mode network, while it is bringing in and moving out all and distributing all of your sensory and emotional input from the external and internal environment, it is also where all of your imagination is happening. It's where all of your call them holographic simulations of reality are also happening there for the first time. Your emotions and your future, what you think is being represented in a 3, maybe even 4 or 5 dimensional hologram inside your default mode network. Because what you're doing is your brain is creating or representing stimuli, imaginary stimuli, against your default mode network to be prepared to act against it. And again, that's what anxiety is when you come across a situation that you haven't prepared for. This is why I say that if you when someone asks you a question and you don't have a response that isn't prepared, you haven't thought about it. This is exactly what I'm talking about. That means that you haven't run the simulation in your default mode network. That means you literally haven't done the simulations, the first simulations in the pre-verbal parts of your brain. You haven't thought about it at all. No thought has gone in to what you're saying. Moving on, quote, intermediate to these are the sensory and motor association areas and other association networks that are involved with conceptual organization of information related to environmental input, such as the central executive and salience interoceptive networks. I already read that, but I wanted to read it again, end quote. Because the intermediate to these are the sensory and motor association areas. That's why, like, if you're having a thought in your mind and you don't even realize that you're having like a conversation, you're having a pre-verbal conversation in your mind, like you're running the simulation of that argument that you had, looking for the more appropriate response, and then you have like a bodily response, or you say something out loud or don't mean to. That's because the simulation has gone from the DMN into the other parts of your brain. You started to conceptualize it as real, what you're thinking about. Moving on, quote, we have argued that the DMN's role in flexibly integrating representations across conceptual space, from concrete sensory representations to more abstract schematic representations, are fundamental to its role in representing the self. Recent studies have emphasized a more general role for the DMN in human cognition, characterizing it as supporting high-level sense-making and conceptualization. Such roles are compatible with the self-making hypothesis, which incorporates elements of both. While the integrative functions of core DMN regions have been primarily studied in the domain of narrative self-related processes, a more compelling model emerges when considering the role of core DMN regions in supporting integrative processing across the narrative and experiential self-domains, subquote, instantiating a uniquely deep and domain general model of the embodied self, end quote, and also end subquote. What I meant to say was end subquote. Continuing on, quote, the DMN and the experiential self. The DMN's integration of information includes interoceptive representations of the state of the body, which form a core part of the experiential self. The main cortical contributor to the representation of interoceptive states is the anterior insula. It also sits atop a hierarchy of neural processes that extend from the peripheral nervous system to brainstem and subcortical regions, comprising the brain's central, autonomic, or salience interoceptive network. The higher order representations that are encoded by the anterior insula are integrated with other cortical networks to provide the somatic component of self-representations, end quote, in the middle of a paragraph. That's what I'm telling you when I say that your brain sends information to all of these different places for them to also run the simulations for you. Moving forward, quote, the peripheral nervous system is continuous with the body. The afferent pathways relevant to interoception are composed largely of type C unmyelinated fibers, which are exposed to the extracellular environment along the lengths of their axons. These phylogenetically ancient systems provide information on the infernal milieu and help to generate the positive and negative feeling states related to basic life functions, e.g. thirst, hunger, pain, and basic emotions, e.g. sadness, fear, joy, end quote. This is what I'm saying when I say that, like, your emotions are linked by memory to your sense feelings. Like, that's what nostalgia is. Like, you also remember what you felt. In fact, you remember what you felt better than you remember what you thought. which is interesting because I can clearly remember what I thought in different highly emotional states in my life. But I was already, as a very young person, much more highly organized and integrated in my internal life than other people were because of my childhood traumas. So I wasn't familiar with my emotions because I didn't have a lot of them, but I was familiar with my thoughts because that was the only person I talked to every day. Moving forward, quote, interoceptive pathways interact with subcortical prefrontal systems that coordinate the affectively balanced character of mood states. These comprise the frontoamygdala, frontostriatal, and hippocampal prefrontal circuits. They have in common that the subcortical regions send efferent projections to the MPFC, which acts to integrate the signals and provide top-down regulation of the processes. The subcortical prefrontal circuits are modulated by monoaminergic systems, which also modify the mood state. The MPFC is richly innervated by serotonergic, noradrenergic, and dopaminergic neurons, as are the amygdala, striatum, and hippocampus. The MPFC in turn projects to monoaminergic neurons. It is the main source of afferent connections to the dorsal raphe nucleus, from where most serotonergic projections originate. End quote. You don't need to know what any of that means, because I don't know that I know what all of it means, besides what I've said, that the signals they bounce around to different parts of your brain because different parts of your brain are designed to do different things. Quote, the experiential self, imbued with feelings and motivations, is underpinned by the complex interplay between the interoceptive, subcortical, prefrontal, and monoaminergic systems. These systems are represented at higher levels via activity of the anterior insula and medial cortical regions, and via these regions and their cortical interactions influence the content of the narrative self. End quote. Do I need to read that again? I'm going to read it again because I stopped paying attention, but give me a second. No, I don't, because this is what I keep... They're just repeating themselves a lot. I'm actually going to skip a paragraph, and we're going to go straight to the self-axis. Quote, as a matter of experience, the self is bound into a single phenomenon, one that can be felt subjectively and, at the same time, thought about as a cognitive entity. Here, we might consider the complex hierarchical integrated brain processes that support the sense of self as forming an axis. From a brain perspective, the system commences with the processing of bodily sensations at the level of the spinal cord, rising through brainstem and subcortical regions, and then to cortical networks that integrate contextual information with the DMN and its core regions sitting at the apex. Activity across these levels coincides with a unified experience of self that spans the continuum from subjective felt experience to abstract self-representations. The self-axis therefore encompasses both the brain processes and their psychological correlates, consistent with a dual-aspect conception of material and mental processes. As we have emphasized, the MPFC has a particularly important role. It operates as an intermediary between external and internal representations, as befits its rich club role in integrating cortical network activity. As our own work has shown, MPFC has a gating effect on PCC activity, selecting relevant self-representations as appropriate to the external content. The MPFC also acts as the fulcrum between the cortical and somatically embedded brain systems. It is not only a key contributor to cortical network coordination, but also directly influences autonomic and neuroendocrine output. It generates affective meaning by integrating affective processes with the relevant environmental context. I wish that they would just... end quote at the end of that paragraph. I wish they would just say this in plain language, because I've already said all of this and explained all of this, and just explaining their earlier stuff, They really do find it difficult to talk about this stuff, and it doesn't help that they're using so much jargony nonsense language. Okay, let's just move on, because I'm about to just say, yeah, this article was a waste of my and your time. Hopefully, there's been something that we could pull out of this conversation. Quote, the self-axis in depression. The brain regions that are implicated in depression show considerable overlap with the regions that support the self, with multiple levels of the self-axis being affected, modulated by the activity by neurotransmitter and neuroendocrine systems, cortical and subcortical influences. The significant role that the MPFC plays in depression has been one of the most striking findings from imaging studies of the disease. Early nuclear imaging studies showed that depression was characterized by increased activity of the subgenual cingulate cortex, a part of ventral MPFC, and other studies have confirmed increasing resting state activity and connectivity with the region. Studies that have examined how thinking about the self's attributes affects MPFC activity have been inconsistent, showing both increased and decreased activity, in part related to the different nature of the tasks, e.g., responding to pictures versus words. Our own study examined the brain response of depressed patients as they judged whether self-descriptors applied to them, assessing effective connectivity between brain regions activated by the task, i.e., the influence that one brain region had on another. It showed that NPFC exerted greater negative influence on the PCC while depressed participants thought about themselves than it did in healthy control participants. The extent of this was related to a symptom factor associated with difficulties with attention and was also stronger when participants had social anxiety disorder, leading us to surmise that the more negative MPFC-PCC connectivity observed in depressed patients reflected their increase in self-focused attention and difficulties in shifting their attention from internal to external representations, end quote. So again, what I'm saying, if you have social anxiety, you're a narcissist. If you call yourself an introvert, you're just a narcissist. If you have chronic depression, you're just a narcissist. You're just thinking about yourself too much. Moving on, quote, difficulties with attention are also reflected in a reduction in activity and connectivity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in depressed participants. Dorsolateral and medial cortical regions have been observed to show anti-correlated activity in normal brain function. And in depression, the reduction observed in dorsolateral prefrontal cortical activity is correlated with increased subgenual cingulate cortex activity. These shift in balance are also manifested as a relative failure of depressed patients to suppress MPFC activity during attentionally demanding tasks, suggesting an intrusion of self-related thoughts during efforts to concentrate on events external to the self, end quote. That's exactly what I said. People who spend their time distracting themselves from their thoughts will eventually find a constipation in their brain that makes those thoughts that they're trying not to think about unavoidable. That's what alcoholism is, people. Quote, altered activity in subcortical regions contribute to the experience of the self and depression, with increased amygdala responsitivity to emotional phases, suggesting increased sensitivity to the social environment, and decreased activation of the striatum to self-related stimuli and to rewards, together with its reduced connectivity with MPFC contributing to anhedonia, end quote. So basically what they're saying here is exactly what I've been saying. If you feel like you should feel bad about something, you will respond to other people's emotions as though they are negatively judging you. So if you spend your time negatively evaluating yourself, you will assume that other people are negatively evaluating you. So if you respond to everyone as though they are a hater, the only person who hates you truly is you. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk, and I need to be done because I'm pretty well done with talking about this, because reading that article, the grammar and the word choice and the punctuation are really bad and really annoying. But it's what I've been talking about since the first episode, depression. Everyone is depressed. The whole, we're going to make every individual a city and a sovereign nation into themselves is depression, because you have to be self-critical. And if you don't have the skill set to be self-critical, all you can do is what you have been taught to do, because the only skill set your mother actually gave you was negatively value judging everyone. And so, if you're the kind of person who identifies the other as the self and the self is good, then all you can do is allow people to treat you badly, or allow people to do their thing and ghost them. You can't stand up for yourself, because if you say you are me and I am you, and what's good for you is good for me, and what they're doing is bad for you, you can't defend yourself. All you can do is cut them out. All you can do is cut them out like they're a cancer, but they're not a cancer. They're a human being. And if you don't tell them, hey, this is what you're doing wrong and I need you to not do this, then they can't be self-critical. They don't actually know what you think about them. And so if you're the kind of person who's obsessed with what people think about you, but you don't honestly tell the people around you what you think about them, you're a narcissist. You're a narcissistic psychopath. In fact, you're only doing harm to the people around you. And if that's not who you are, then who you are and what you do are at odds. And no wonder you're depressed. Even your own pre-verbal examination of your choices is saying this isn't who you are. And you are a harm to us. You're allergic to yourself at that point. Your thoughts become allergic to yourself, and nothing you say is representative of who you are. And if nothing you say and nothing you do is representative of who you are, what are you doing? What are you doing? Who are you trying to be, and who are you pretending to be? That is pretense, and it used to be the biggest sin to be pretentious. It used to be terrible to be pretentious. And so I say to you that if you aren't willing to take criticism, I'm thinking about Dr. Justin Sledge of Esoterica. If someone says to you, hey, your content has gotten bad, and you say, fuck you, you're blocked now, your content not only has gotten bad, but your internal monologue, the way you think of yourself, is so fractured that you know I'm right. And so the only thing you can do, instead of correcting your behavior, is cut me and my criticism out, because my criticism is reminding you of your internal thoughts that you're hiding from by making bad art. But everybody knows this. Everybody knows this deep down, whether it's pre-verbal or post-verbal, doesn't matter. We all know this, and we all act like it's not true. And this is it's what I'm railing at and against everyone. When I'm standing in the middle and I'm saying there is a third way. There is a way to be better. There's a way to say, I am me. You are not me. What's good for you can be good for me. But if you and your behavior is not good for me, I can respect you by forthrightly engaging in combat with you. And how that combat is manifest is entirely up to you and your choices. But see, people don't understand that is, in fact, occupying the very highest ground. Because only the very most powerful kings and emperors were allowed to occupy that ground. When Charlemagne occupied that ground to the ruler, what are they called? The emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire in his lifetime. It wasn't called the Eastern Roman Empire. It was still just the Roman Empire. They weren't Byzantium yet, right? They weren't Byzantine yet. when he came to them and he said, "We are equals, you will treat me with the proper respect," the Eastern Roman Empire declared war on him, right? So you have to understand that if you're going to say to someone, "I am me, you are you, what's good for me is good for me, what's good for you is good for you," and if we work together, we're working together, but if not, if you choose to treat me with disrespect, we will be working at odds. You have to understand that some people are going to see that as a declaration of war, and not everyone is going to see themselves as equal or superior to you. Most people are going to see that declaration as superior to them, and they are going to engage you in guerrilla warfare, meaning they're going to come after your family, they're going to come after your friends, they're going to come after your job. They're not going to come directly at you and your claims. They're going to undermine everything about you so that you will call the world haters, so that you will learn to hate the world. Because in hating the world, all you're doing is hating yourself. By saying these ugly, hateful things about how the world is so much worse than it used to be, and people are so much worse than they used to be, and things are so bad, and the future is only bad, all you're doing is declaring a self-fulfilling prophecy. All you're doing is making sure that it will be, because all you're doing is saying that you're not fighting back. And to me, not fighting back is the most abhorrent thing. As human beings, as civilized human beings, the meaning of life is to find the people who want to occupy the same kingdom as you do, and making that kingdom real in this life, not the next, not in fiction, not in scripture, not in art, in fact. Depression is indistinguishable from thinking about yourself. So if you're sad and you don't feel like you can get over your own depression, just pick someone and do something nice for them. Build them up in some kind of way. And don't look at me like it's not what I do. If you look at my likes on Twitter, if you look at how I engage on Twitter, I mostly punch up at larger accounts that do what I do, and then I try to be within the first 10 likes of the people who follow me, because that's called being respectful, and that's being reciprocal, and that's saying, hey, I see you, you're not invisible. It's saying that even if I don't value everything that you say and everything that you do, I value you, and I'm looking for common ground with you. And whether it's working or not, it doesn't matter. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm going to continue doing. It's what I'll do for you if you're listening, and it's what I'll do for you if you're not listening. I began this not frustrated. I began it not really feeling anything in particular emotionally, feeling pretty good about myself creatively. But I have ended it frustrated, because psychology is a dead end. If you're looking to psychology to have answers to the meaning of life, it's a dead end. Psychology is just repeating what the esoteric, the hermetic, and the Buddhist, Eastern in general traditions have been saying since time immemorial. If you want to combat the suffering, the terror of history, the only way to do it is to look forthrightly at yourself, say, what am I doing that's hurting other people, and stop those things. And then to look out at other people and say, how are they suffering differently than I am, and what can I learn about how they see the world differently from how I see the world? Because seeing how we all see it the same, that is only a fight against suffering. I was talking with someone recently who thinks that Irish people give in to the suffering, and that they're sad, and that to be Irish means to be genetically predisposed, and therefore to genetically justify depression. And it's like that's an upside down and inside out. That's a therapist's interpretation of how the Irish actually exist. The drinking is traditional because the only way you could survive in Europe in the middle period was to drink, because you had to cook the water. The alcoholism is cultural. It has nothing to do with combating the sadness, combating the suffering of history. The alcohol is there because of the other things that are happening around it: the singing, the dancing, the storytelling, the art, the poetry. All of those things are how you combat the sadness. And if you're not engaged in something that will meaningfully allow you to self-examine yourself, if you're not doing, as an example, if you're not doing some of the things that I'm doing, easy, distracting hand and eye distraction, so you can dive deeply into your own thoughts and think about your own thoughts. If you're not meditating, so you can dive deeply into your own thoughts. If you're not praying, if you're not going to church, if you're not being honest with your therapist, you're not doing anything. You're not doing anything, and that's why you're sad. The reason you're sad is because you're not doing anything. Do something. And don't just focus on doing something that makes you feel good, because feel is a chemical response in the brain. And doing something that feels good because it's novel to the brain. But the more times you press that button and you send that chemical into your brain, the less good it's going to feel. So don't chase making yourself feel good. Chase making other people feel good, because the endorphin response to seeing someone else have a novel experience, a novel good experience, will never go away. That there is no tolerance to that, to making someone else, to experiencing someone else's joy. And the reason that there is no tolerance to that is because everyone's novel joy is idiosyncratic to them. So empathetically experiencing their novel joy is novel to you every time, because their joy, just like their sadness, is idiosyncratic to them. And so if you take the time to understand why they're joyful, you will experience that joy because it's idiosyncratic to them. You will experience it for the first time because it's theirs and not yours. Sharing in someone else's joy is the Christmas gift that keeps on giving. You get to open it every day. Focus on that. Focus on honest criticism. Not just saying something hurtful, but saying something true that they can fix. It's not just about giving them a bad grade. It's also about giving them the answer to the test. Something that I never liked growing up was teachers who would just mark you wrong. Mark me wrong, but also tell me what I did right, because if I'm going to look at the test to see my grade and it doesn't have the correct answers on it, why am I looking at the test? Why did you give it back? Why didn't you just put my score? Why didn't you just give me my grade card? If you don't give me, it's like at work, right? If like I used to work with ice cream, so it's like, if I make for you a shake and you don't like it, but you don't tell me what you would have liked it to be like, I can't make it the way you want it. All I can do is make it wrong. And in our current culture, and I'm stealing this from Jordan Peterson, but Jordan Peterson was actually absolutely right to call it this. And the current liberal progressive culture of you're doing it wrong is the point. We're not telling you the correct way. PC has gone from politically correct, saying what we would prefer to hear, to just being offended and not saying what we would prefer to hear, giving the impression that we would just prefer that particular people not speak at all, which is what it's about. It's about censorship without calling it censorship. But that's what the liberal needs, right? The liberal is a chronically depressed person. If you've ever met a liberal who's not chronically depressed, you've met a really good liar. You've met a remarkably good liar. Because the liberal is the only person with chronic anxiety. Conservatives don't have anxiety because conservatives, like I said, when a conservative makes a mistake, when a conservative politician sleeps with someone who's not his wife, or when a conservative politician accepts a bribe that they shouldn't have accepted, they mea culpa for it, and then if they continue to repeat the behavior, they get kicked out of the club because they're not improving, because they know what they've done wrong, they're given the answers to the test, and if they continue to score badly on the test with the answers, it's like, well, you're just not trying. Liberals, on the other hand, they don't give you the answer. They tell you what you've done wrong, but they don't tell you how to fix the behavior. And that's what anxiety is. They want one another to be anxious because being a liberal isn't about having merit. It's not about getting the answers to the test. It's about being popular. It's about looking like you think the same as everyone else. That's why they all have crazy hair and dress crazy. And that's it. That's all I have to say today. I've hit 2 hours. 2 hours was my goal. Thanks for listening. Thanks for making it this far. You know what to do. Like, subscribe, watch more of my stuff, share it to your friends. Hit me up on Twitter. It's @ShaggyPhilosoph. Yeah. Thanks. I'll be back.